here with us today. So Tori was born in the Bay Area, California, and she moved back to Asia as an adult to spend 10 years here to connect back with her roots. So she's a seasoned leader with a track record of brand building and growth across iconic billion-dollar brands for P&G worldwide. And she is also very committed to driving social impact and addressing social inequities. So currently she's the CEO of Remote Year, the leading community and platform for remote work and travel. So I'd like to invite her to come up and share her thoughts with us.
Everybody, thank you so much for having me. First off, I cannot tell you how excited I am. Some of you guys know that I just landed around 12:30 or 1 a.m. and I had calls until about 5 a.m. this morning. I created a couple slides at 5:30 a.m. and shot them off to Justine, who was waiting very patiently. And then I woke up at 9 a.m. this morning for calls at 9:30. So I have been running on fumes, but this is such an important occasion for me, an important topic, an important group of people. So I'm gonna get a lot of energy from you guys, but I wanna say first off, thank you to the organizers for putting this together. And Emily, thanks for our first call that led to me being here today. So today I'm gonna talk a little bit about my unbelievable journey here, how I created the life I always dreamed of, and hopefully by the end of it, you take away that you too are either creating the life that you've always wanted, or you can too figure out a new path for yourself. So who am I? I hate that in the US, a lot of times people lead with their professional resumes. So I'm gonna get that out of the way. You guys already heard a second ago, I'm the CEO of Remote Year. I've been working for Remote Year for about 7 years now, and I've been sitting in this role for just under a year and a half. And Remote Year is essentially a travel company that brings together remote professionals to live, work, and travel around the world together. And people sign up for either 1 month, 4 months, or 12 months. And during the course of the next 4 days, I think you'll meet 2 people who are traveling with us on our programs, but I'm happy to talk to you guys about that separately as well. But that does not really define who I really am. And the reason why I said yes to coming here today was because there's 4 parts of my identity that are super important to me. And this literally checked every box. Number 1 was being an Asian, specifically a Vietnamese woman. Number 2 was being a woman. Number 3 was being a businesswoman and entrepreneur. And the 4th one was being what I like to call a conscious traveler or a good citizen of the world. And today I'm going to touch a little bit upon all 4 of those themes. I'm going to go a little bit zig-zag through my life and try to put together some pieces that hopefully inspire you as you think of yourselves as Asian women who are probably working in business and also traveling, and what inspiration that can serve for you. All right, so I like to tell my story in pictures. So first off, I was really touched that out of the many times I've spoken around the world, many people never ask me, how do I say your name? What's your name? So this is my full legal name. I haven't seen it since my birth certificate, but it's Lê Phạm Hoàng Tức. And I remember in kindergarten, I used to try to tell people how to say my name, and that didn't go well. And I just came home and told my mom and dad, I'm never ever gonna tell anyone my real name again, because they don't deserve it. They don't deserve to butcher my name, and I'm not gonna give it out anymore. So this is the first time I've seen my name on any sort of document in front of people, and I wanted to show you guys that because it's really special for me to hopefully connect with other people who might resonate a little bit with my life story. So I'm gonna start from the very beginning, and that starts a little bit with my grandparents. So my grandparents were born in Vietnam during French colonization. That was a long time ago, but as you can imagine, there were a lot of restrictions on rights. They had to speak French. So I always grew up hearing about some of their struggles during French occupation. Later on, I learned that both of my grandmothers both dropped out of school when they were in 2nd grade and in 8th grade to get married and have children. Can you imagine being that young and getting married and having children? And they both had 10 or 11 children on both sides. So they spent pretty much their entire lives having children, taking care of them, or taking care of them, or taking care of them, or taking care of them. That's it. And I remember hearing these stories all the time when I was growing up about my grandmothers being so smart, but being forced to drop out of school even though they didn't want to. Well, later, both of those grandmothers had my parents, and they are complete opposites. So my mom grew up in the highlands of Vietnam. There's an area called Đài Lạt, which some of you may know. It's very beautiful. And it's in a mountainous region. And when she grew up, it was customary that people got married when they were 14 or 15 years old. So my mom, I'll tell that story in a bit, but she's very elegant, she's soft-spoken, she's demure, she's kind, she's intelligent. She's all the things that you would imagine someone to be from the highlands. My dad, on the other side, is from the Mekong Delta. He grew up very much in the countryside in a town called Vĩnh Long. He is abrasive, crazy, he's fearless, he's incredibly smart, and he's always ready to throw down in a fight. Always. So hopefully over the next 4 days you guys will see which parts of the DNA I took from both of my parents. But eventually my parents met each other on a college cruise. And my mom would always tell my dad, I'm not ready to get married. You're gonna have to wait until I have a job, until I'm situated. And that was just something that my grandparents couldn't understand. They were like, you're getting such good offers for marriage from all these great eligible men. Why aren't you saying yes? And she kept insisting that she had to go to college and she wanted to finish out her career aspirations. So my dad waited until my mom was 24, which is quite old from where my mom is at. And he did it because he thought she was worth it. And they started a great life together. My dad had grown up very poor, but made it very high in the government at the time, in the Southern Vietnamese government. My mom had grown up wealthy and continued to be wealthy and went into working for a university. So both of them went to the top 2 schools in Vietnam, were extremely educated, had a great life, until they didn't. Then the war broke out in Vietnam, and as you guys know, that flipped everybody's life on its head. So my parents went from having this wonderful, stable life that they had always dreamed of, to the next day, figuring out how to fight for survival. And because my dad was high-ranking in the government, he ended up getting put into re-education camp, which we know is a very polite term for reprogramming and torture. So he spent time in prison, and the whole time he kept thinking, you know, what am I gonna do when I get out? And when he got out, he was blacklisted from everything. And my parents still, even despite him being blacklisted, wanted to stay in Vietnam and try to make it work even after the war. And the only reason they started thinking about leaving was not actually because of how hard the conditions were or how they had lost everything in the war. It was actually because when you are a child of a blacklisted official, it means that you can never go to school. And to 2 of my parents who valued education and learning so much, it was almost unfathomable that their children would not be able to go to school after a certain age. So my parents decided to leave in the middle of the night. They left on a tiny fishing boat of 52 people, and they took off from the coast of Vietnam. And they took off with 3 boats. And 1 boat perished, everybody passed. The second boat was actually taken over by pirates, so they all passed, or we don't know what happened. My parents' boat was the only one that made it. And when they got to Malaysia, the Coast Guard, by then, it had been 3 years after the war. And they were very much wonderful, but tired of also the influx of Vietnamese refugees that had been arriving day after day. So they told my parents, there's no way that you guys can land on the shore, you guys have to go back. And out of a room of 52 people, and I say room, but I mean boat, my mom was the only one that knew probably 10 English words, enough to say, no food, no fuel, we can't go back. And they let only my mom off that boat. And after about a week of her being on the shore, she kept begging the officials over and over to let the rest of the people off the boat, including my dad and everybody else who was there. And the officials kept telling my mom, no, you're so beautiful, why don't you marry me, stay here, and let your dumb husband go back to where he came from. And my mom kept fighting, and finally she got everybody off the boat. So they started their lives in Malaysia with my brother, who was just 4 months old, and they lived in a refugee camp for about 1.5 years. And during that time, my mom repeatedly kept pulling out and saying, I don't want to go anywhere else but the US. So we've got to wait for the US interviews to come around, because that's the dream place. If we're already going to lose our country, our land, our culture, everything, we might as well go to the top. So they luckily made it into the US under political asylum. And we started our lives then in Oakland, California. Yes, Mr. Mayor, people here, right? So we grew up with not a lot. My parents came over with $30 to their names. So much of our childhood was just watching them put their lives back together where we were growing up. And we grew up extremely poor, on welfare, in a public housing project. We didn't have any toys. We weren't allowed outside. But for some reason, I never knew that we were poor actually until much later in life, when I realized I had the same dress on in 4 years of school pictures. And I was like, wait, I didn't have any other clothes. But during my childhood, I remembered one tradition that stuck out for me. We would always sit on the floor, and because we didn't have furniture, all of us slept on the ground together on a little bamboo mat. In Vietnamese, we called it a chu. And it was my favorite thing to just sit there at night and listen to my mom and dad tell stories about their childhood. It made me feel super connected to a country that I had never been to, was not born in, but I felt like I was living their childhood through their eyes. And every night, my parents were phenomenal storytellers. I would just sit there enraptured as they were telling us all these stories. But there were 3 that stuck out to me. The first one was, I remember my mom telling me that when the suitors would come to her house when she was 14 or 15, my grandparents, her parents, would always praise her in front of the suitors and say, "This is our daughter," my mom's name is Len. "This is our daughter. She's so good that when she walks down the stairs, she walks so quietly that the stairs don't even creak. She makes no noise when she walks." And they were so proud of that. Like, this is why we should marry our daughter. That was the first story I remembered. The second story I remembered was my mom telling me about how one day she looked outside her front window and there was a procession, a wedding procession happening. And there was a roast pig that was being carried through the streets in happiness and as an offering to the man's family. And she kept thinking, oh, that roast pig's gonna taste really good. I hope I get to have some later. But the next day she woke up and the same pig was getting paraded back through the streets toward the girl's house. And one ear was cut off. And I was like, what does that mean, Mom? And she said, well, that means that the girl was probably not a virgin and she's being returned to her family. So that was story number 2 that I remember. Story number 3 I remember was I started asking my dad, Dad, I don't understand why women in our culture don't get treated as well as men. Why are we not worth as much? And he told me, instead of validating that was wrong, he said, well, yes, men are worth more, because when the parents pass on or the ancestors pass on, the guy, the male in the family, and he was the oldest son, we're the ones that are going to bury our parents, pray for our parents, and clean the graves every year for the ancestors. And I was like, well, anybody could do that. And he was like, no, it's reserved for the son. It's the most important role in the family. So those are the 3 stories out of many thousands of stories that I heard that stuck with me for the whole life. And it really made me think of a few things. One is that women, especially Asian women, we are supposed to be valued based on how invisible we are, how quiet and silent and compliant we are, how we are supposed to follow rules, and how our worth is determined sometimes by other people, other men, our culture, our society, and that the most important roles in life are reserved for men. Those are my takeaways as a young child that really shaped the way that I viewed myself as I was growing up and would ultimately be the foundation of my youth and a lot of my early thinking in life. So I tell you guys all that because those were the formative years, and you can see in these pictures, even my mom on that left side, she's trying to hide herself even in her picture, right? The next one is my family, you know, in that one chair that we had our whole childhood in our house. The third picture is me just trying to fade into the background. I actually vividly remember that day. It was one of my graduation days. And my sister turned to me and she said, you know, our lives would be easier if we were white. And I was like, what? That's ridiculous. And I remember still to this day that conversation I had with my sister. And the fourth one was, as I started growing up, I realized that I felt like I was living in this box, in this confine, and I didn't want that for my life. So I started doing crazy stuff. I started figuring out what my hustle was at 10, 12 years old. And I realized I was really good at selling things that I did not want. So I don't eat sugar, I don't like sweets, So we started just selling candy all the time. I was like, hey, never get high off your own supply, right? So I started going to Costco with somebody else's membership and buying boxes of candy and selling it at school, at games, anywhere I could for $1 each bag. And I started making thousands of dollars each year. I would save about $5,000 to $7,000 just on selling stuff. If someone was giving something up, I wrapped it back up and sold it to somebody else. If my brother was making Rice Krispie treats, I put some in a foil bag and then I took it out and sold it. I sold everything. At school, we had competitions for selling candles, Girl Scout cookies, anything. I was always a top seller, and I would take all my prizes and sell those too. And I did it because I had this dream. I knew my parents did not have money to take us anywhere. We never went on vacation. But I knew that if I saved enough money, I could buy my own plane ticket somewhere. So that fourth picture is actually me crazily taking out dollar bills out of my Nike box and buying my first plane ticket to Spain. And I was so proud of myself until I realized in that picture I'm sitting in front of a 7-Eleven, and you can't see it, a little convenience store. But I had forgotten to book a place to stay. So I spent a night sleeping outside on some grass, drinking something to keep me warm, and just thinking, okay, next time I have to do a little more research. I can just show up somewhere, but that's really how I actually travel a lot. So then going on to the next one, I ended up deciding, okay, I have to get out of my hometown area. I need to go somewhere that puts me in a very uncomfortable position so I can grow. I started learning languages like crazy, studied history, politics, government, anything that I thought could make me someday live better in a different part of the world. And my parents were super upset about that, because imagine thinking that you almost died getting to the US and your daughter, your youngest daughter, tells you, actually, I don't want to live here. I don't feel like I was born to be here. But they indulged me and they kept taking me to all these classes and whatever programs that I wanted to be in. And ultimately, I started applying to colleges, and I just looked up randomly, what are the schools that are the furthest away from home? And I applied to all the Ivy Leagues, Stanford, Berkeley, everywhere that I could think of, just to kind of prove a point, even though I knew I couldn't afford to go. And somehow, miraculously, I got into all of them, and I got full ride scholarships from every single scholarship foundation you could think of, and that really changed my life. Because for the first time, I didn't feel limited by what somebody had told me my circumstances were. I actually felt like I could start to carve out and create the world for myself that nobody would think was possible. And so I decided to apply and get into Yale. And the far picture there on the right is my first time actually ever being around other Vietnamese people. So my entire childhood, we were the only Asian family. We were the only Vietnamese family, and later on when there were one or two other families that came in, they still kind of shied away from any sort of fellowship with Asian people. So I'd always just kind of blended in, whether it was Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Black people, any kind of people, I blended in. But I never ever saw someone that had anything similar to me in my roots. And when I got to Yale, I was so excited because my brother, my sister, they had ended up going to schools with large Vietnamese populations, and they would always come home and tell me about all these Vietnamese people they met. And I was so excited until I realized at Yale, out of 4 years, there were only 9 of us. But that was enough. That was enough for me, because for the first time, I met people who could pronounce my name, who could actually cook and eat the same foods that I did, and really took me under their mentorship. And I think they must have had some secret meeting after and said, let's try to get this girl right. She doesn't know anything about our culture. And I'm going to tell a story later about something that happened there that really changed my life, but I want to say that was one of the most pivotal moments in my life, being around other Vietnamese people and being around other Asian people. So fast forward, I ended up graduating from school. It was a wonderful experience. In 4 years, I felt like I'm getting closer to something. I don't know what that something is. I did 4 study abroad programs. I did 4 internships for the UN and humanitarian organizations. So I was living this incredible life, but I didn't know what I wanted to do after college. And while I was working in these humanitarian organizations, a mentor of mine came up to me and she said, I don't know if you know this, but you're in the wrong career for you. And as someone who had this altruistic view of myself, oh, I want to be poor and save the world, it was really heartbreaking to hear her tell me that I was in the wrong career for me. But I took her advice and she told me move to New York, sleep on someone's couch, and say yes to the first job you get in business. So I did exactly that. I didn't even know what business was, but I started learning at a startup that ended up growing to be about 200, 250 people before it went bust. But during that time, I got noticed by a bunch of people, got recruited to come work at Procter & Gamble. And that, again, took me on another trajectory in my life of, again, now being in a position where I'm at a company, and P&G at the time was, and still is, the #1 CPG company in the world. It was valued at about $90 billion. And so for my parents, it looked like I had achieved this American dream that they wanted for them, for their children. And I kept working there, even though I felt like, God, I'm working 14 hours, 18 hours, not because I have to, but because I feel like this is what it takes to achieve in life. And I had a wonderful time there. But I told them, you know, I've worked for you guys everywhere, Latin America, Europe, Africa, Middle East, but where I really want to connect with is my roots in Asia. And I would love to do my next assignment in Asia. So in that first picture, I asked them to send me to Singapore. And I ended up doing a few years working in Singapore and then Japan. And I became the first ever non-Japanese, non-male to ever lead P&G's largest and most profitable business in Asia and Japan. And it was such a big deal for me. I was like, God, you get paid to move around the world. And it was a different side of travel that I had seen. And in the next picture, you can see, because Singapore and Japan are right close by to Vietnam, I ended up flying every single month to Vietnam. And this is significant because, you know, I'll talk about this later, but my parents had vowed that they would not ever come back to Vietnam. They wanted to remember the country in their head and not have it, you know, dirtied by any sort of modernism or anything. They wanted to just remember the country they left behind. So my dad has never been back ever since the war. And my mom has actually been back twice, but for only 2 days to bury my grandparents. She has not seen anything outside of that. And so I had begged them over and over, please, please, I want to take the whole family to Vietnam. Let's go explore our roots together. And they kept saying no to me. So finally I just started going by myself. And I didn't tell my parents because I was so afraid how they would react or how they would view it. So I ended up going 40, 50 times. Eventually, you know, even staying there for about a year and a half at a time. And I would just always keep it a secret. I never posted about it, never talked about it. But that was really the start of me feeling like, gosh, I have another part of my identity that I haven't explored enough, and I'm just at the very beginning of it. So then the third picture, a moment where I was sitting there one day and I realized I have the perfect life on paper. Everything looks great. I am having a wonderful job. I can afford houses, cars, Chanel and Prada purses, trips around the world. I can take my parents on any trip they ever dreamed of. This was one of the trips I took them on. And I remember just sitting there, and I was taking my dad and my mom to this restaurant where it cost about $500 or $600 per person. And my dad said, this isn't even that good. And you guys know how parents are, right? Especially my dad. He was like, the bread is just the bread I could get at any bakery. And I was like, God, you're so ungrateful. But that day I remember just thinking, I have all this money, but I have no time to enjoy it. I have no time to have time with family, with friends. Every relationship I had ended for the same reason. You're married to your work. I never see you. It was always the same exact thing. So I was like, what's the point of having this perfect life on paper when you actually don't have time for the life itself? And I started thinking, I need to figure out what the next move is, and I'm gonna really upset a lot of people who have invested in me to get me to this point, but I'm gonna quit my job. And so the next day, I handed in my badge, and I bought a one-way ticket to Kenya. And I called Goodwill, Salvation Army, and I told them, if you can come to my house in the next 24 hours, you can have everything in anywhere that I live. So they took everything out, and I downsized my entire life to one carry-on bag, and decided I'm going to start my journey off in Kenya, but I'm going to travel around the world to 100 countries, and I'm not going to work again until I finish seeing these countries without being on calls, without being in meetings, and I'm really just going to enjoy learning about other people's cultures and customs. And I started that trip off in Kenya with some friends, And that started off a wonderful exploration. And I started bouncing around the world, living life on my terms. I thought I had made it. Every time I came home, my parents would say, you know, it's really hard for us to explain to our friends and our neighbors what you're doing with your life. And I was like, well, why does it matter? And they're like, well, they see you on Facebook and Instagram, but you don't have a job, you don't have anything going on in your life. I was like, well, I read the news and I'm learning new skills. I'm still doing something productive. But there was almost this shame that was cast on me because I wasn't living the life that everyone expected me to live or someone who had had my credentials should be living. But I was so happy. I was so happy. And I kept traveling, and I started getting really confused about my logistics, and one day I hear about remote year, and that absolutely changed my life. I was like, wait, there's a company that brings together people like me. I didn't even know people existed who wanted to travel and work remotely, still want to be productive, not have to take a sabbatical off, and be able to have fun every day in between meetings and between calls. I had never heard of other people that thought this way. And so I immediately applied to be a customer. And during that interview process, I realized a few things. Nobody looked like me. Everyone looked like somebody who was traveling to have a good time. And to put it really more bluntly, you know, it felt like a fraternity of white men traveling around the world. And I didn't identify with that. And so I said, you know, you guys don't look and feel like where I want to put my money or my time, or the type of people I want to be on a trip with. But I love this concept. And if you want to actually have more meaningful travel or build a more meaningful community, I really hope that you call me someday. I would love to help you guys expand to Asia, to Africa, Middle East, or just even travel the world more thoughtfully and more consciously. And my mom was laughing because she was sitting right next to me during that interview. She's like, they're never gonna call you back. But believe it or not, 8 months later, they called me. And they were like, you know, we thought about what you said, and we don't have a role for you, but we think you're the type of person that needs to be here. And I was like, well, here's the thing. Now that I've thought about it even more, I don't think you should hire me because I'm very outspoken, I'm very vocal. Now I'm even more clear on who I am. And there's a lot of things that I'm gonna say that are probably gonna rub people the wrong way. By the way, here's my politics, here's my everything. I told them everything. And I was like, if you bring me on board, you are going to bring all of this on board with me. And I don't think that you guys know or are ready for that. And so they said, you know what, you're probably right. And I for like a month or two, I kept traveling. I told my mom, oh no, I think I went too far. And she was like, you did, you know? But in the last picture, what ends up happening is 2016, the elections happened in the US. And I had 3 job offers that I loved. One was, if this is recorded, just take this part out. One was for the CIA. And the other one was to be a CMO of a company in marketing where I worked in. And then a third one was actually remote year telling me, we think we're gonna have something for you. We thought about it, but we're not sure. We'll get back to you. So I had like 2.5 offers on the table. And when the election happened, I couldn't believe that it had happened. My top choice was actually to work for the CIA. And I had been spending about 1.5 years interviewing, going through the whole process. And I had started to get really excited by it. And when the election happened, I was like, there's no way I'm going to support my government in doing anything that I don't believe in. So now I don't have that job offer. And I texted remote year that night and I said, okay, I'm gonna hop on a plane to Chile. I'm gonna go to Rapa Nui, Easter Island, and I'll land by the morning. But if you can text me or send me a contract in the next 24 hours, I will sign it and I will start. And somehow, I didn't even have an offer from them yet, but I have this audacity. And they wrote me back and said, here's your contract. And so this picture is the next day where I'm standing. I had just hiked up to the crater in Rapa Nui. And I remember just standing there and I was so full of joy. And someone snapped this picture of me. And this guy sent it to me later. And he was like, I had to send you this because I saw such this incredible joy from your face, and I was wondering, what is that girl thinking about or laughing about while this, wind is whipping her hair, my hoop earrings fell out my ear, which is why I'm holding it. And he sent it to me, and he was like, whatever joy you have in that moment, hold on to it, and good luck in life. And so that started off my journey with Remote Year. I told them, thanks for the contract, I have to move it back 5 weeks because I'm gonna enjoy 5 weeks disconnected on this island. But when I start, I'm gonna bring all of me, and I can't wait for you to meet all of me. And that started off a 7-year career working at Remote Year. And I started off first expanding Remote Year throughout Asia. So we ended up going to about 9 different cities there. And it was really special for me because one of the stipulations I had was if I get to do Asia, I want you to know that we have to enter into Vietnam and we have to enter in Japan. Those are 2 must-haves for me. And so being able to go back and actually build this bridge, both personally and professionally, was the first time that I found it was possible to connect my personal and professional lives together. And over that time, I started working in Asia. Then I took over our global experience team, so figuring out how to transition this company from a more logistics-focused company into an experiential, customer-driven company. And then after that, I started taking over pretty much every team you can think of: the product team, marketing, brand, even sales at one point, new products, etc. And in every single one of those roles, I just kept expanding and I kept being happy. And I remember, coming home and my sister would just say, ugh, you used to always go everywhere in 6-inch heels, hair done, nails done, purses, everything. And she's like, now you're in shorts and a tank top. Like, you're such a bum. But I was a happy bum. And that's the point of that story. So during my travels, there were 5 lessons that I would love to share with you guys that most impacted who I became in life. So the first one was this notion of claiming your voice and your space. So in my first assignment at P&G, I actually was tapped to become the lead negotiator for a team that was working on a deal between P&G and Pocky, that you guys know, Glico, Pocky, Fret Sticks. And I was so scared. I was 21 years old, and I tried to look older. I wore glasses, pearls, heels, and a suit. And I just wanted to, as always, blend in and not really kind of show or stick out in any sort of way. And even though I was the lead negotiator of 20 people, when we arrived at the Glico headquarters, I don't know why, but I let them usher me into the furthest seat, right at the very end of the table. And everybody else took all the center seats, and I just sat all the way in the corner. So they just assumed that I was somebody's admin. And I wasn't offered kind of any of the same gestures that the other people were offered. One gentleman on our team, he was the oldest white male on our team, he sat right in the center. And so for the next 2 or 3 days, they thought he was the leader of our group. And I never said anything. I never spoke up, I never said my role. But as the negotiations went on, it became obvious that I was the one who was making the decisions because people kept consulting with me in between the conversations. And then somebody told me, why did you not tell anyone? Why did you let them think that you were the admin or the secretary, which again is nothing wrong, but it wasn't the role that I had come there for. And later on, a P&G president pulled me aside and he said, never ever do that again. He was like, why would you minimize yourself? And he was like, you don't have to be arrogant or you think it's even arrogant. He was like, but next time, if you're leading something, take the center seat. He was like, sit where it's appropriate to what role you are playing there or where you want to be seen. So if somebody who you want to see or talk to is sitting on the corner, then sit on the corner. If they're sitting in the middle, sit there. He was like, but figure out in life, what is the center seat position that you want and go there and claim it. And he said, second of all, he was like, there's things that I've noticed about you. And I didn't notice it until he brought it up to me. But my whole life, maybe because I didn't learn English until I was much later in life, I was really nervous about speaking publicly. I was afraid kids would make fun of me, I wouldn't pronounce something correctly, so I never did it. Even when I had a point of view, I kept quiet. So all of my report cards said the same thing. Oh, she's so smart, she's great. She never speaks. She doesn't ever share her opinion. She always has a good one, but she doesn't share it. These were all of my report cards. Then they became my performance reviews. She's brilliant, she's wonderful. She doesn't talk enough. She doesn't speak in a meeting. And so the same P&G president said to me, he said, I don't care what it is, but my challenge for you is to figure out how do you come into a room and just throw your voice in the room. He said it could be simple as, hello, how are you? He was like, but let people hear your voice. Say something. And I told him, but culturally, like, I just feel like some people just talk so much and they just repeat each other's opinions and love how they sound to each other in meetings. And I've never wanted to be that person. And he said, but you have a story to tell. You have opinions. Let me next time, if I come into a room, I better hear you throw your voice in the room. And so that became another mantra that I always wanted to adapt to, no matter what space I was in. Figuring out where's the center seat for me that I feel comfortable in, and also figuring out how I can throw my voice in the room. The last one is, boardroom conversations. Now I've obviously had many roles in life, and I've always been struck by the same feeling that I hear people describe other people the way I was once described. And I always disproportionately hire Asians, POCs, women, people from different marginalized backgrounds. And I always hear them, they're doing well, but they never speak up. They're shy, they're quiet, they're this, they're that. And I always speak up in those boardrooms because sometimes they're not there, but I want to make sure I throw my voice in the room for other people too. So I hope that that's something that you guys take away as something you also can do. The next one is never ever lose your culture, lead with it. I think just historically, it's amazing if you look back at our history that many times we have had a history of assimilation for survival. Even my name, my last name is Le, and in old times in Vietnam, people would always change their last name to be the king or emperor's last name to plead alliance, loyalty, allegiance, prove that they were part of the same kind of politics. So we've always done that. We've always blended in because it was necessary for survival. And that's what I've always done. And there was one day when I was sitting at Yale, there were 3 of us who were invited to do a radio interview for a SoCal Vietnamese radio station. And I was so embarrassed that during that interview, we couldn't even cobble together a few sentences in Vietnamese between the 3 of us. And all of us understood it perfectly, but just couldn't say anything in Vietnamese. And the radio host said, oh gosh, that's so sad. They've lost their culture. They're American now. And I remember I had a retort, but I didn't have the words to say it back to her. No, we're not, we're Vietnamese. And I remember just being so indignant at that moment. But then I looked at myself and I was like, she's right, I have lost my culture. I have somehow blended in so much into American culture that I have lost my roots. And that day, I made sure to join a Vietnamese language class, join a Vietnamese culture class. We fought actually for the school to recognize it and bring it to the school, so we ended up doing that. I ended up somehow running to be the president of the Vietnamese Alliance, which was again 9 people, but I was proud of myself for winning. But then I ended up running for the Asian American Alliance, which is the biggest club at Yale, about 1,800 people, and I became the first Vietnamese person to ever sit in that seat. And while I was there, I kept growing the Vietnamese club, and we ended up growing it to about 300 or 400 people, even though we only had 9 people at the school. And that showed me that when you lead with your culture and you don't lose it, and you actually take the time to learn it, teach others about it, immerse yourselves in it, immerse other people in it, they will find something so valuable, even sometimes more valuable than you find your own culture. But don't ever lose your culture, always lead with it. And now I realize that after working at P&G all those years, I never took off Lunar New Year or Tết, even though it's the most important holiday in Vietnamese culture. I took off Christmas, I took off regular New Year's. I didn't take the one that I actually cared about. And it was because that was always the worst time. Our company had the company firm, annual firm every year in February, January time, so it's the worst time possibly to take off. And so I let that dictate me pushing my own culture aside. And so now, some of you who know me know that I am very loud during Lunar New Year now. Every year, I tell people about it, I teach people about it, I take off the whole time, and I bring everyone along on my journey. I make people spell my name right. I do everything that I possibly can to make sure that I lead with my culture first. And then another one is we can because of our culture, not despite of. I realized that even in the way that I spoke about myself was almost like, despite this, I did this. It was always a story of adversity. It wasn't a story of triumph. So I would always say, you know what? I'm so glad that I can speak English, despite the fact that at home, my parents didn't ever speak it. We didn't learn it till we were 10 or 11 years old. I always had an excuse and another reason why I had to overcome something. I always thought of it as a crutch or a handicap of some sort. I would say, I'm not gonna get the jobs that I want because culturally, I might not be the best person for the role. I'm not extroverted enough, I'm not outgoing enough. I would always say things like that. Then I realized one day, I need to figure out how do I say, because of my culture, I can do this. And that really unlocked a completely different way of how I viewed myself and my work. The first thing was when I started taking over Remote Year's Team Asia, the team wasn't even Asian. We had, for instance, in the first time we launched in Japan, we had 4 white Americans running our Japan business. And that really pissed me off. I was like, why do we not have people who are actually from the local communities that we're going to, actually showing people about the culture and the community? So I set a goal to change out all the teams and make sure that we were 100% locally staffed in every single location that we did. That was my first thing. And when I brought on this team, many of these are Team Asia here, they were exactly like who I saw myself 10, 15 years ago. They were all incredibly hardworking, shy, quiet, kind of just kept their head down and did the work. And one day I had a call and I was like, guys, they're thinking about canceling Asia from the itinerary because they think that people don't want it. The scores keep coming back, they're not great, the customers are not rating us well for Asia. And I was like, can I just lead a weird brainstorming session and say, because of our culture, what can we do? And we all kind of came around this idea that nobody knows better than Asian people how to make people feel cared for and taken care of when you step into someone's home. Someone's gonna ask you, have you eaten yet? 3 people asked me that the minute I even hit the door today. Are you comfortable? Do you need anything? And it's not because we're soft and bending over backwards, it's because we were raised to care for one another in family units, community villages, and really taking care of people outside of us, outside of our families, but still treating them like families. And I shared with them this concept that I love so much when I was living in Japan called motenashi. And the idea is when you walk in, somebody's already thought of everything before you can even think of it. And there's this care and hospitality almost without expectations, like the way that your slippers point out from the bed, or there's new slippers when you get to the bathroom. It's so well thought out, and I really enjoyed my time living in Japan. And we said, we're gonna be the team that's famous for making people feel like family. So in the course of the next few months, 6 months, we ended up actually becoming the highest, most profitable, highest scoring region for a remote year. Everyone obviously got promoted on Team Asia. I wanted to make sure that people saw that our culture wasn't a crutch. It was because of our culture that we were able to identify a new way of thinking about the business, and that became the model that I eventually took on when I moved into the global experience team and started doing that around the world. And the last thing I'll say here is, be famous for something. And when I walk into a room now at Remote Year or anywhere, people know, oh, she is going to say this. She is going to feel this. This is her opinion on this. And sometimes I think it's good, sometimes it's bad, but it's clear what I am, what I represent, what I stand for. And somebody wrote this on my 360 feedback when I got promoted into a higher role at Remote Year. He said, anonymously, but I knew who he was. He said, I am a white male, and I don't think that I can be successful under 2, because I'm a white male, and I'm not sure if that's going to allow me to be successful under her, because she's so strong and she's such a proponent of people of color, Asians, women, and I don't know if I fit that category. And I remember being pissed off at first because I knew exactly who it was, and thinking, oh, I'm gonna confront her, I'm gonna say something. And then I thought about it and I was like, you know what, actually, let me just let that sit there, because I'm so proud that your fragility actually somehow thought maybe because this girl is so sure of who she is, that might diminish my light in some way. And I didn't do it, but he eventually, obviously, apologized to me much later on. And everyone knows that I do treat people extremely well, but I do care a lot about inequities, and I use any role, any platform that I have to help solve some of those. And if some of those rub you the wrong way, great, either I'm in the wrong place or you're in the wrong place. But I am very famous for it. So now when I sit in a room and I run the marketing team calls, they already know, oh, too, we were gonna show you these, but we realized it doesn't fit your 51% POC rule. Sorry, let me redo those and I'll send them to you tomorrow. I'm like, great, I didn't even have to say anything. They spoke for me because my values came first, who I was came first, and now I don't have to explain that myself anymore at all. Another thing is show up for other marginalized groups. One thing that I realized when I was young was I heard a couple stories. Urban Outfitters, you guys might have heard this like many, many years ago, published and created these shirts. Two longs can make a white, get your Buddha on the dance floor. Like if one of us had done it, okay, maybe I'll chuckle on the side. But to see a company profiting off of making caricatures of Asian cultures made me really pissed off. And I remember asking everyone, wait, where's the protest? Where are we going? There was none. There was a small one in New York City, and outside of that, there wasn't anywhere else. And Urban Outfitters came out and they issued a public statement and said, actually there was an Asian designer on our team, and we're so sorry if you were offended, and we promise that when the shirts sell out, we'll stop selling them. And I remember that so vividly in my head, because I remember thinking, they don't think we have a voice. They don't think we protest anything. They don't think we stand up for anything. And later when I went to Yale and I saw the same thing, there was always satire in these magazines, and there was one in particular on April Fool's Day that made fun of Asian women and Asian men. And I remember talking to the editor at a party, and I was like, why would you even think that was okay to publish that? And he said, well, because we knew you guys weren't gonna do anything about it. And I never forgot that. And so what I would say is, don't just show up for ourselves, don't just show up for other Asian women, Asian people, show up for other marginalized groups also. I don't care if it's LGBTQ+ women, Black people, Latino people, whatever it is, indigenous, show up for other people and have a stance, a point of view on things, and use your platform for good too. And when you look at Black Lives Matter and all of these things that have been happening around the world, genocide, conflicts around the world, etc., and then Stop Asian Hate came out, and we expected everyone to speak up for us and to say something for us. But how many times did we show up for other people? And so what I would challenge you guys to say is like, don't let Urban Outfitters happen to us. If something happens in our community or to other people's communities that are adjacent to ours, use your platform in some way and fight that injustice in whatever way you can. It doesn't have to be marching in the street. It can be as little as what I do every day, hiring and making sure that I recruit, I mentor, I put things out from a work standpoint that also stand up and align with my values. Those are our ways of protesting, but have a little protest culture in you. And then the last one here, I promise, is create your own definition of happiness. You guys probably heard in my whole story, there were a lot of definitions that other people gave for me. This is what you should do too. This is what happiness or success looks like. We have so many cultural expectations on our shoulders all the time, and it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, you're the one that has to live with yourself and look at yourself every day. So I make sure that every time I'm at a fork in the road, I pause and I think back to what was the last fork I had in the road and why I chose to go left or right and how did I feel afterwards. Every time I make a big pivot in my life, I immediately journal that day and I say, this is just a guiding principle for the next time I'm at a fork in the road. And I wrote many times in my last fork in the road, I don't want to sit in my office. I don't want to hide what I did on the weekend on Mondays when people ask, how was your weekend? I want to work around people I can talk about politics and social justice with. I want to show up as myself. I want to hire people that look like me, think like me. Yes, I do. And I don't want to hide it. And so I make sure that I put that on paper and I revisit that every time I have to make an important decision. And the last one is this 3-day rule. I remember my president at P&G, I asked him, how do I get to sit in your seat someday? What decision lens did you use? And he said, just use the 3-day rule. Don't ever wake up for the 3rd day unhappy. Ask yourself every morning, am I happy today? Am I happy with where my life is or where it's going? And if your answer somehow is no, change something in your life, but don't wake up one more day or one more night unhappy. And so I've kept that every morning. The first question I ask myself in the shower is, where's the conditioner? Am I happy today? So those are my top 5 lessons. I'm gonna end with one piece here. A few years ago, I was very, very lucky to go to Vietnam. And I remember thinking to myself, I didn't tell my dad this, but I think I'm gonna go try to trace his footsteps back in his hometown. And he didn't have an address for me, but my dad is such a good storyteller. He would always say, oh, our family owned the only gas station in town, it's just one pump. And if you take that same street along the Mekong Delta for 37 kilometers, then you turn 1.5 kilometers, then you get off of that, and you take a motorbike straight into the rice fields for at least, he said, about 4 to 5 minutes, get off and walk 2 to 3 minutes. That's where our family's ancestors are buried. And I was like, well, if anyone can trust instructions like that, it would be someone like my dad, because he has a very crazy memory. So I showed up in Vietnam, his hometown, and I did that. I found where the gas station was, the one pump, it's now 2. And I took 37 kilometers, then there was a left turn for 1.5, and then that's where I got lost because I didn't have a motorbike. It just looked like a lot of, rice everywhere. And I remember just knocking on every single door, trying to figure out if somebody had a motorbike. And the sun started to set, and I was really upset. Like, God, I should have planned this a little bit better. And my partner was with me. He was like, I don't think we're gonna find it on this trip. And I told the taxi guy, I was like, look, I'm going to pay you so much money. We are going to find this. Please don't give up on me. And so we just kept going around, going around. Finally, I remembered that my dad used to tell me that in his neighborhood, he was always known for being the one that was the smartest, that got out, went to school, everyone knew him. And they all knew him as Uncle Four. And he told me, if you ever get stuck in my hometown, just say your last name and say you're the daughter of the fourth son. And I was like, okay, it's crazy. So I went and I knocked on someone's door and I said, hi, I'm the daughter of Uncle Four. And they started screaming. Everyone started screaming. Lights came on everywhere. They were like, don't move, stay right there. And they took off and they came right back with 2 motorbikes, one for me, one for my partner. And they drove us into the rice fields exactly like 4.5 minutes. And then we get off, we walk about 2 or 3 minutes, and there was this plot of land that my dad had told me about where all of my ancestors were buried, all their gravestones were there. And the one thing I had planned was I had brought incense sticks and everything with me. And for the next hour or so, all my extended family started telling me stories that validated every story my dad had told me. Some of them I had always thought, oh, he's probably making this up. But they backed up every single one. That's where your dad crawled for 2 weeks to get to freedom. That's where he almost died. That's where he got bombed. And I prayed over every single ancestor's graves. I paid somebody to come in to help me come clean them all out. I did everything, and I never told my dad. And the next day he called me, and he was almost in tears. And he said, I heard you went to my hometown. I didn't even tell you to go. And I was like, I know, but I went. And I had never heard my dad say, I'm proud of you, ever in my life. And he still didn't, actually. I still don't know. How do you say I'm proud of you? I actually don't know. But he said, you did something that even I couldn't do. I'm the oldest son, and I was supposed to do that for the last 40-something years, and I never went. But the fact that you went there, I can't put into words how I and my family feel. And so I'm gonna end there by saying, I started off with this story, laying on the floor, listening to my dad talk about how every important role was reserved for someone that didn't look like me or wasn't me. But somehow, through the course of my life, I've charted a life that has meaning for me. And I've been able to use my platform in some way to give back, to do things that I'm proud of. And even if somebody else is not telling me they're proud of me, I know that in that moment, I'll never forget this. It was the most meaningful thing I could have done for my parents, and honestly for myself. So wherever you guys are dealing with in life or thinking about or what path you're trying to chart for yourself, just remember, it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. When you're standing at that fork in the road, when you're thinking about your 3-day rule, or what your North Star is, your why, your purpose, carve it out for yourself and think 5 years out, is this what I want to look back on as something that had meaning for me and really, really shaped who I became. So that's my story. I want to say thank you so much for listening to many crazy stories, I'm sure, and I hope that you took away one thing that resonates with you. But thanks again for having me. I really appreciate you guys all. That's my Instagram or my LinkedIn. Also, that's Remote Years if you want to also learn more about Remote Year. And Emily already shared this on your group chat, but I've never done this actually for any other group, but we are offering a free membership just to AWW for 1 year. And we also, right now, we're running a promotion, so we have a 10% cash back happening for 1 more day, actually till tomorrow. And you get 10% back towards local experiences for any trips that you book. So this is not a sales pitch, but if you guys have more questions about it, feel free to come up to me. All right, thank you guys.